Barbasol, Barbasol, no brush, no lather, no rubbing, wet your razor then begin.
Hi, I'm Sue King, and I'm the archivist at Morrison Reeves Library, and I'm also on the board of the Wayne County Historical Museum. I was scheduled to be the speaker for the Adult Speaker Series, which was scheduled in June, but obviously that's probably in jeopardy right now, so they asked me to create this little video to talk about the topic for that night, which was Singin Sam. His real name was Harry Frankel, and he spent most of his life in Richmond, Indiana. He was a hugely popular entertainer in the early days of commercial radio. So most of the 1930s, he was a household name, Singin Sam, and for at least the first part of that decade, he was the Barbasol Man. He spent his childhood, about his first 10 years of his life in Danville, Kentucky, and it influenced his love of music and the love of that style of music as well. And it became part of his persona for the rest of his life. In fact, at different times in his later career, he billed himself as the boy from old Kentucky. When he was about 10 years old, his family moved to Richmond, and his father owned a clothing store. Actually, his several generations before that also were clothiers. And probably Harry was expected to go into that line of business as well, but he simply loved music. He had no interest in owning a clothing store, although apparently he was somewhat of a snazzy dresser, but he loved performing. He and several of his teenage buddies would, organize barbershop quartets. But it wasn't until 1908, when he was about 20 years old, that he got his first real paying job as an entertainer. He was hired by Coburn's Minstrels. Now, this was 1908, and so minstrel shows were still hugely popular. He traveled with that show for 7 or 8 years, actually came back to Richmond for several years. In 1924, he was hired by the Al G. Fields Minstrel Show. That was the biggest of all the minstrel shows, although by 1924 it was the last of the minstrel shows. And that form of entertainment was thankfully declining and on its way out. That troupe then closed up by 1928, and Harry joined a guy named Joe Dunleavy, and they formed a duo. And the story goes that in, I want to say, Minneapolis, the theater owner asked them to go on the radio, the local radio station, to promote the live show, do a couple of numbers, and, but it was still to get people to come to the live show. And so they did. And this was the first time, this is, these guys, and all entertainers pretty much to that point, performed before a live audience. And so this was the first time these two guys had performed for nothing but a microphone. And it was, reportedly Joe Dunleavy said that this is stupid, I'm not going to do it. But Harry was intrigued. He, if nothing else, he knew that this was the future. Vaudeville was starting to wind down, and he jumped on to the next big thing. Back when he actually came back to Richmond for a while, and one of his golfing buddies was a guy named Tom Nichols, and he was one of the executives of the Great States Lawnmower Company, which, of course, Richmond was the lawnmower capital, so this was one of the companies that was here in Richmond. And that company had just signed with WLW radio station in Cincinnati to do a radio show. And Tom Nichol asked Harry to perform on that program. And he did. And he was just hugely successful. And eventually, the scouts, I guess you could say, for Barbasol learned of his program, heard him, and they wanted him for their program. And so in July of 1931, Singin Sam the Barbasol Man was sort of introduced to America. Because back then everything was live, everything was broadcast live. So he had to move to New York City and do this 15 minutes every night that was broadcast across the country. Now the thing was, he hated New York City. He was massively successful. At one point in the early 30s, he was second only, his show was second only to Amos and Andy, which was another just wildly popular program. He was successful enough that what he did, he made a deal with the Barbasol Company that he could broadcast once a week from Cincinnati, from WLW in Cincinnati, that would then be piped into this national network. He could do that once a week, and he could drive down to Cincinnati once a week and then still stay at home in Richmond, which is all he ever wanted to do. And so that's what he did for several years. What also happened, though, in New York was that he met his wife, a woman named Helene Davis, who was another vaudeville performer for most of her life. She was coming off of being one of the performers that went overseas with actually it was the YMCA, to perform for the Doughboys in World War I. And from that experience, she earned the nickname Smiles, because she actually introduced that song to the boys over there. And according to the stories, whenever they she became so popular and so identified with that song that whenever they wanted to hear that song or wanted to hear her, they just asked for Smiles. And she was known as Smiles till the day she died. And they met, so Harry and Smiles met in New York City. They hit it off. Actually, because he was so popular, he had so much fan mail and he really wanted to answer it all, but it was just absolutely overwhelming. And so initially he hired her to be his secretary, but then they, got closer and closer. And by 1934, they were married. He brought his bride home to Richmond, and she stayed in Richmond. Even after his death, she stayed in Richmond. So by about 1936, it was actually Smiles who talked him into shifting. She thought that he was losing his identity as Singin Sam and becoming the Barbasol Man. So she was the one who sort of initiated the shift. And so he started singing for Coca-Cola. It was another 15-minute program it was called Refreshment Time with Singin Sam. And this was different in that it didn't have to be broadcast live. By this time, radio stations were able to actually play records. They were called transcriptions because they were on a large 16-inch disc that held 15 minutes worth of airtime. And what he was able to do, again, he wanted to stay in Richmond. He did not want to go to New York City. So what he did is he traveled to New York City, and for 2 days, he recorded 10 programs. And then he came home and was able to spend the rest of the next 12 days at home in Richmond. The thing was, the way this program worked was Coca-Cola then took those 15-minute programs, reproduced them on these large 16-inch discs, and then shipped them out to all their local bottlers, who then played them for their local radio stations. And so this format was just perfect for Harry. He again hated Richmond, hated New York, wanted to live in Richmond always. And so it was perfect. So his arrangement with Coca-Cola then lasted until 1942, when there was a nationwide musician strike. And so pretty much all of the radio shows really had to come to a stop virtually. And so that whole the refreshment time program pretty much ended at that point. This was during the war. Harry continued to make personal appearances. He was in the newspapers and the radio magazines. He did guest spots on other shows and that sort of thing. And then for a brief time, he also, Barbasol brought him back. He broadcast from Indianapolis for about 6 months. He was the Barbasol man again. Then after the war, he formed his own company. It was called Transcription Services, and he hired some musicians and made his own shows. Now this one was called Reminiscin' with Singin Sam, but it was exactly the same format that he'd used for Barbasol and Coca-Cola. It was 15 minutes. He sang 4 songs and, had a lot of, I think they called it patter. And so it was just a very, down home. Again, he loved the old songs. He used to brag that he never introduced a new song. He liked the old ones. And so that was his thing. And he recorded 260 of them. And I'm not really sure if that's what he wanted to record and he was going to stop, or if his death sort of ended the company. He died of a heart attack in 1948 at the age of 60. So that's Harry Frankel, aka Singin Sam, in a nutshell.
Barbasol.